All right. Hey there, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Mike Kajeski. I'm the CEO and co-founder of MedCrypt. Um, for those of you who are unfamiliar with our company, we are a med tech focused cybersecurity company that helps med tech companies satisfy cybersecurity requirements for medical devices. Wanted to talk a little bit today about some of the changes that we've seen in the regulatory landscape and specifically some of the financial consequences that we've seen hit medical device manufacturers due to failure to comply with these issues. I think there's a lot of discussions around the requirements themselves, what the FDA requires, what European regulations are around cybersecurity, but I have seen less discussion about the economics of the problem and how the problem affects medical device manufacturers economically. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on today. As an aside, we try to make these webinars fairly informative and useful for you and not very salesy. So I'd love some feedback here at the end of the presentation on how well I did that. Also, would love to have people ask questions as we go. We've got a Q&A function in the webinar, and I believe that people can raise their hands as well. I actually see one person with their hand raised here. Oral, I'm going to get through a couple slides here, and then if your hand is raised intentionally, happy to allow you to ask that question. Very good. All right, well, let's get started. So we have seen some changes in the regulatory environment and the medical device cybersecurity landscape broadly that has, really created some significant financial impacts for medical device manufacturers. So one cause for this, healthcare providers really are struggling with cybersecurity. They're struggling with a lot of things, cybersecurity being one of them. It is reported that in 2024, the last year for which there is reliable data, US hospitals lost about $20 billion due to ransomware, which is a really big number by any measure. On top of that, the hospitals themselves are struggling financially. So it's not entirely clear how well these healthcare providers are going to be able to solve this issue on their own. As a result, we've seen regulators taking action. So in the US, the FDA has been issuing an increasing number of cybersecurity warning letters, hold letters during 510(k) submissions, holding medical device manufacturers to a higher standard than they have historically. They've also made some changes that we'll talk about to the way that they inspect quality systems and the way that they look at cybersecurity in a post-market ongoing manner. And similar changes are happening in the EU. So there are changes coming this September that require medical device manufacturers to report cybersecurity issues, vulnerabilities, incidents, even in things that are not directly medical devices. So lots of changes here for device manufacturers to keep up with. So let's talk about the providers a little bit. Assuming that those of you joining here today work in the medical device industry, your customers usually are healthcare providers, not patients directly. In the US, we spend about $5.3 trillion on healthcare per year. 1.6 trillion of that goes into what's broadly defined as hospitals. The average hospital operating margin is just under 5%. As far as businesses go, it's a fairly low operating margin, right? Like grocery stores are a notoriously low operating margin business, and their operating margins are about 3%. But that's the average. About 53% of hospitals lose money in any given year. And that data comes from the American Hospital Association. So the median hospital out there is losing money. The ones that are making money are just barely profitable. And what this means is that any unexpected expenses that hit these providers can have devastating consequences to their financial operations. A really interesting statistic that came to light during the 2024 Change Healthcare cyber event is that the average healthcare provider in the US has about 6 weeks of operating capital on hand. And it took hospitals and Change Healthcare about 8 to 12 weeks to be able to reinstate some of their IT systems after that cyber attack. So what that means is the average hospital in the US, if they get hit by a ransomware attack, it will likely take them longer to recover than they have cash in the bank. So it's a really perilous situation for these hospital systems in the US and around the world. The situations are different, but not much better. The cost of ransomware is increasing, and the rate at which is increasing every year. Like it's getting worse faster. I've been working in healthcare cybersecurity since about 2014. And I remember when we were first raising money for MedCrypt, talking to investors and having them say, like, is cybersecurity really a thing in healthcare? Is this just HIPAA compliance? Because HIPAA fines are notoriously small from a healthcare industry size perspective. So is that really all we're looking at here? And then in 2016, the reputed to be the first a successful ransomware attack on a hospital occurred. So losses in 2016 were, on the order of tens of millions of dollars, and in 2024 the losses were $20 billion. So the losses due to successful cybersecurity attacks on hospitals have been increasing exponentially. That is despite increasing regulation, increasing focus from these organizations on cybersecurity, to some extent, increased spend on cybersecurity. Problem's getting really, really bad. And to give you a sense of just how bad it is, the US healthcare system, hospital systems, profited about $150 billion in 2024. So they lost $20 billion due to cybersecurity events, and they profited 150 billion total. So really what that means is they should have profited 170 billion, right? So essentially almost 12% of their net profit is lost due to successful cybersecurity breaches. If we compare that to neighboring industries, it's many, many times worse than financial services or the energy sector. The financial services industry, broadly speaking, banks and credit card companies and companies like that, uh, they lose about 2% of their net profit due to cybersecurity events. And when we ran this analysis and found these numbers, it was kind of shocking to me because, what's that truism? People rob banks because that's where the money is. Like the industry that actually has the money that people could steal through a cybersecurity attack are losing money to these attacks at like 1/6 the rate of healthcare. So healthcare just really is a prime target for cybersecurity attacks. These attacks have been, unfortunately, extremely successful over the last few years, and we are not doing as well as our neighboring industries at defending against them. And the scale of the problem is getting worse over the recent years. So this is a graph here that shows in red the losses due to successful ransomware attacks, not even cybersecurity attacks broadly, but ransomware attacks specifically. And then in blue here, the rate or the amount of money that we are spending on cybersecurity defenses. So what this graph shows is that over 10 years, from 2016 to 2025, we've increased our spending on cybersecurity defenses about 2.8 times. It's a significant growth there. It's larger than the rate of inflation, but certainly not 10% per year. But our losses due to cybersecurity breaches have gone up 13 times. So the gap here is widening fairly significantly. And I mean, honestly, it's not clear to me what can reverse this trend, right? We would need to cut ransomware losses in half or more in order for us to make a meaningful improvement on this problem. And for the sake of clarity, it's not my position that we should necessarily be spending 13 times more on cybersecurity defenses either. In fact, there are a number of economists that study what the optimal amount of cybersecurity spend is for an industry. And healthcare is, according to these models, not spending as much as we should. Like, we will still get tremendous positive returns on investment if we spend more on cybersecurity as an industry, but it's not necessarily 13 times more, right? But I think that the question is, why has our spending on cybersecurity only gone up 2.8 times in the face of these losses? And two things come to mind. Number one, we have, as an industry, primarily placed the responsibility of cybersecurity in healthcare on hospitals. I know that everybody says that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility between medical device manufacturers, IT providers, and hospitals and users. It is a shared responsibility. That is true. But lots of data suggests that the burden has been placed disproportionately on hospitals. And the number two issue is those hospitals don't really have more money to spend on cybersecurity. So it's not clear that they could have increased their spend on cybersecurity more than they have. So really what this has resulted in is regulators, I would say, giving up hope that hospitals are going to fix this on their own. There is some proposed legislation in the US that focuses a little bit disproportionately on hospitals. It's a bill going through the Senate called the Healthcare Cybersecurity and Resiliency Act. It is coupled with some changes to HIPAA that look to modernize the HIPAA cybersecurity requirements and make HIPAA fines a little more meaningful for healthcare providers and other companies that deal with PII. But it's really dealing with a very small sliver of the problem. Part of this legislation looks at increased fines for hospitals who are found to have been negligent leading up to a cybersecurity breach. And I certainly understand why legislators would want to hold healthcare systems responsible for, in their words, being a poor steward of their patient data. But if you spend any time in a hospital, you know that these people they're trying to save lives. They're focused on patient outcomes as they should be. They're operating in a tremendously difficult and complex economic environment, and they're really not well positioned to put cybersecurity defenses in place, right? And I think there was a study that's a couple of years old at this point, but it showed that the average hospital in the US has less than one full-time employee focused on cybersecurity. It was like zero point 0.8 cybersecurity FTEs per hospital. So the idea that we're going to fine hospitals who are already losing money for failing to secure technology products that they've bought from other vendors just seems like a not scalable solution to the problem. So in the US, at least, the FDA has really started to turn the screws on device manufacturers and companies that are submitting for new approvals for 510(k)s and PMAs. The FDA's pre-market cybersecurity guidance has been around for many years at this point. It's gone through a couple of different iterations and drafts. There was a new draft that was finalized this year. I would argue that a lot of the requirements in those guidance documents have not historically been enforced by the FDA, and that is largely changing, right? One very easy example of this is that the guidance document says that you should be tracking all of the software that is in your medical device, including but not limited to operating systems. You should be tracking when the end of support date for those pieces of software is, and you should have a plan to replace software that is out of date. The translation of this is you shouldn't be using unsupported operating systems. So if you have a medical device that was approved through a 510(k) pathway 3 years ago that was using, Windows 7 or Windows 10, a lot of device manufacturers assume that making a minor change to that product and resubmitting a 510(k) will result in those minor changes being approved. And that hasn't been the case in the last 18 months, especially in the last 6 months. We at MedCrypt have seen a number of medical device manufacturers receive hold letters from the FDA asking questions about things like unsupported operating systems, and eventually getting so much pushback from the FDA that either the submission is rejected or not approved, or the submission needs to be abandoned while the device manufacturer goes and updates the operating system that their medical device is using. So that enforcement is real and is happening in a way that wasn't happening in prior years. Another interesting statistic that we've seen here is that the average medical device manufacturer submits a new 510(k) every 2 years. There are some device manufacturers who have an update cycle that is much faster than that, and they are filing a 510(k) every year, every 9 months. But the average device manufacturer submits a new 510(k) every 2 years. So that means that many device manufacturers have not submitted a 510(k) in several years. So the assumption that a small update to a currently approved device is likely to be approved is not necessarily a safe assumption, given the fact that the FDA is enforcing these regulations in a way that they weren't historically. By the way, we'll talk about this in a couple of slides, but it's not just the pre-market guidance that the FDA has begun to enforce. They really are now looking at the post-market guidance and planning an update to the post-market guidance, and have already begun to enforce the post-market cybersecurity guidance in a way that they haven't historically. In the EU, there is a new requirement for device manufacturers and companies to report cybersecurity incidents, breaches, vulnerabilities I think it's as quick as 24 hours after the discovery of a breach to file, a notice of a breach. And then there are some timelines where increasingly detailed information needs to be reported to the governing bodies in the EU. And it's not just regulated medical devices like pacemakers. It's companion applications, cloud services, mobile applications, all these sorts of peripherals. And that's a fairly difficult requirement to satisfy given the workflows in place at device manufacturers today. To my knowledge, there is not a similar requirement in the US for a device manufacturer to report cybersecurity incidents in companion applications. If you have an incident in a medical device, it's very clear that you need to report that, and we'll talk about that here in a few moments as well. But including your cybersecurity monitoring to all of the companion applications reflects a new paradigm that really is going to require some work to comply with. And we've even seen individual states put in place requirements or, in some cases, procurement language that target cybersecurity issues in medical devices, healthcare software, and the companies that produce them. The FDA has modified their QMSR inspection language to include cybersecurity as part of the data that they are going to be investigating. There are a couple of publicly discussed stories out there about device manufacturers having their quality management systems inspected by the FDA, having the FDA find cybersecurity related issues that were not adequately addressed, and then those companies facing fines or other bad outcomes as a result. And the cost of fixing those issues is both difficult to estimate and also likely more expensive than you're thinking. I had a conversation with one of our investors who works at a large medical device manufacturer, had come from another medical device manufacturer previously, and was sharing an anecdote about a quality management system audit failure that ended up taking the company 4 years to satisfy. It took many FTEs over those 4 years and materially delayed launches of revised versions of the products and affected revenue there. So how do you estimate the cost of an incident like that? Is it just the direct costs associated with fixing the quality management system? Is it the lost revenue from product enhancements that you would have released that you hadn't? It's a fairly large number. And this person was telling me that the sort of lesson that the company learned is that it is much less expensive to fix these issues upfront than it is to fix them under duress, right? In the context of an FDA inspection or failed quality management system audit. As it relates to pre-market submissions for medical devices to the FDA, we have heard some statistics from FDA that something like 70% of 510(k) submissions are receiving a cybersecurity related hold letter, an AINN letter, and that the average hold letter that goes out lists 17 what they call stock deficiencies. So cybersecurity deficiencies in the documentation that the FDA has seen in other submissions that they're very quickly able to flag, and they have some canned language that goes into the letter. Things like saying, hey, you included a software bill of materials, but the SBOM that you sent us did not include all of the data that's required according to the NTIA minimum elements or something like that. And then the device manufacturer needs to go back and do some homework. Sometimes that homework is literally just changing the documents, improving some of the documentation that you're sending to the FDA. Sometimes it requires a dialogue with the FDA to explain, why certain design decisions were made. But in a fair number of instances, those hold letters result in design changes that need to be made to the device that sometimes takes, months or quarters or years to implement. Updating an operating system version on a large piece of capital equipment in a class 2 medical device, that's a large undertaking. There's a lot of testing that needs to happen there. So it's really important for people who are working in cybersecurity at medical device manufacturers to be able to communicate these risks to their leadership in a way that highlights the economic impact of failing to do these things. Right? It's one thing to be a product security person at a large medical device manufacturer and tell your leadership, hey, we have some security work that we should be doing. It's the right thing to do, and it's going to cost us $2 million and a year to do it. It's another thing to say, hey, we have these specific risks. There are publicly documented cases of other manufacturers with the same risks having recalls or being late to market or having, other publicly documented issues. And if we were to end up in that situation, it would cost us $50 million over a year. We can decrease the probability of that happening by 95% for $2 million today. And it's really that sort of discussion that we think is going to be more effective in helping product security leaders at device manufacturers help their leadership prioritize investment in this area. So a sort of anonymized case study here. There's a medical device manufacturer. This is, all of this data is publicly available on the internet. They found a security vulnerability in one of their medical devices. They fixed the vulnerability. They released a software update. But I think it was almost 18 months later, ended up getting a warning letter from the FDA because of the way that they handled the situation, right? They did not report this vulnerability and this issue to the FDA via the proper channels. They described the software updates as being, as I recall, feature enhancements as opposed to, a remedy for a cybersecurity issue. And I think it was over a year later, the FDA issued this warning letter, and I imagine it was, quite a headache for this company to resolve this issue. I'm not intimately familiar with, this particular manufacturer's view on these cybersecurity issues, but what I have seen are other device manufacturers being really hesitant to admit that they had a cybersecurity issue. I think in healthcare, we've been reflexively trained to think of cybersecurity issues as being tantamount with HIPAA violations, which are legal issues that get lawyers involved. And it's a very scary situation. As soon as lawyers get involved, it's a really, really bad thing. And therefore, a lot of device manufacturers want to contextualize these issues as, this isn't really a cybersecurity issue. It's a bug that we found. We fixed the bug. There are no other issues. But what we have seen is that agencies like the FDA, at least in the US, are very willing to work with device manufacturers who are proactively addressing these issues. We've seen cases where device manufacturers proactively reached out to the FDA and said, hey, we found this issue. Here's how we found it. Here's what we think the impact was. Here's what we're doing to fix it. And we're going to issue a software update here in the next, I'll give you some long period of time, in the next 6 months. And the FDA, in our experience, has tended to be really collaborative with device manufacturers in those sorts of scenarios. It's the cases where device manufacturers have a security issue, they frame it as something other than a security issue, they push a bug fix into the next software update and hope that it goes away. That's not in line with the FDA's requirements, and we've seen those strategies end up costing device manufacturers a whole lot. One other thing to highlight here is that, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert in the legal aspects here, but willing failure to comply with these cybersecurity issues is a prohibited act, which, as we understand it, can lead to things up to and including criminal prosecution for executives who willingly fail to comply with these issues. In other words, by selling a medical device in the US that is cleared by the FDA, you are attesting to the fact that you're following all of their rules and requirements, including but not limited to cybersecurity. And if you know that you're really not doing that, and you continue to do it anyway, like, bad things can happen both for the company and for individuals directly. So the FDA and other agencies in the US, like the SEC, are really taking these issues seriously and are telling device manufacturers and companies, hey, you've got to take cybersecurity seriously. You've got to be proactive about these issues, and you have to communicate to us when you're having these problems. And as we discussed earlier, the EU enforcement of their regulations and new requirements is about to increase here as well. Again, their CRA regulation requires, in this case, device manufacturers to monitor the security not only of the medical devices, but all of the peripheral systems as well, and to report when there are breaches and when there are issues. Post-market cybersecurity is an increasing focus of the FDA. I might not remember the dates directly offhand, but I think the last post-market cybersecurity guidance update was in 2018, and it has been earmarked for update here for several years. I believe that we will see an update to the post-market guidance kind of any day meaning at some point in the next 12 months. But I do know that people inside the FDA are working on an update to that post-market security. And the implications of this are kind of potentially staggering. There's some crazy statistics out there showing that 70% of medical devices in hospitals today run an unsupported operating system. Um, and that's just one category of security vulnerabilities that you could have. There are lots of other interesting articles showing that security researchers doing a basic scan of the internet using something like Shodan have for years and years been able to identify hundreds, if not thousands, of PACS servers that are directly connected to the internet that have medical imaging available. And it's fairly trivial from what I understand to then get access to those images and in some cases even modify the images. We've also seen relatively new systems in diagnostic imaging be sold with DICOM communication that is not encrypted, that is in plain text. And there are lots of like understandable reasons why companies would make those design decisions. Backward compatibility really is a tricky problem when you've got hospitals running 15-year-old PAC servers and they're connecting a brand new CT scanner to it. That's tricky. But what we have heard from the FDA and from other people in the US federal government is just that the legacy device security problem is such a large issue. It is not tenable. It needs to be addressed. And as we understand it, the FDA's post-market guidance is probably the easiest way for the federal government to make a dent here. So, we'll have to see when the new post-market guidance comes out, but, what does it mean for a device manufacturer that has been selling an imaging system for 30 years, that has a version that is still supported, but hasn't been updated in 5 years? Does it need to satisfy all of the same requirements that it would need to satisfy if it were getting a 510(k) today? It's kind of a gray area at the moment, right? But what is clear is that device manufacturers need to have a way to monitor the security posture of their devices, even the ones that have already been approved by the FDA and are out in the field, to know what vulnerabilities are affecting the software in those devices, to understand what compensating controls can be put in place to address these security vulnerabilities, and they need to communicate this to customers. So we frequently see device manufacturers place a big emphasis on cybersecurity leading up to a 510(k) submission. And then when the 510(k) is approved, they say, great, like we're done with cybersecurity until the next time we submit. And I understand why device manufacturers, sometimes take that approach. 5 years ago, that was maybe a tenable approach. But today, and especially in the near future, it is not a tenable approach. Cybersecurity is an ongoing process for these, in some cases, life-sustaining medical devices. And the work is not done when the device is approved by the FDA. So what does complying with these regulations really look like today? It really does start in the design process. We see far too many device manufacturers come to us at step 3 and say, hey, we're submitting a 510(k) in 2 weeks, and here's our security documentation. Can you help us get it in the best shape possible so that it can be approved? And in some cases, the device manufacturers implemented all of the right security controls during the design process, and we just need to document it really well. But in other cases, you see device manufacturers submitting documentation to FDA that is not acknowledging some security limitations that were in the device from the time it was designed. And making changes to the device at this point in the cycle is going to have significant business implications. So they need to just kind of submit with what they have today. And the way around this is to really make product security part of your design process. And I think the pre-market guidance does a really good job of describing this, having a secure development lifecycle of your device. When you're designing the device and you're writing down the list of features and you're creating tickets for engineers to write software to develop those features, you need to be going through a threat modeling exercise and understanding what are the security implications of the device, what could go wrong, what security controls would decrease the probability of these things happening, and critically, how do we know that the controls we put in place worked? And if you're doing these things during the design process, all of the other steps here become much, much easier, right? It's much, much easier to document, to put together a really good 510(k) that covers cybersecurity if you've been doing this from the design process. And it's much cheaper to do it when you're doing it from the design process as well. But then once the device is approved and is on the market, device manufacturers have a legal requirement to monitor the security posture of these devices out in the field and to maintain those devices via software updates and security communications and others. And we see this step four here, the post-market monitoring, being enforced not just by regulators like the FDA, but actually being enforced by the contracts that device manufacturers have with customers, right? Hospitals will frequently say, I will purchase this product, but you need to show me that it is secure today, and you need to show me that you have a process in place to know when a security issue happens and to release a software update to fix it. Right. And then finally, when, God forbid, an incident actually does happen, an incident being defined fairly broadly here, you need what's called a coordinated disclosure process, something in your quality management system that says when an event happens that meets these criteria, here's what we are going to do. And that process involves notifying people, notifying FDA, notifying users, notifying customers. And I think for a lot of device manufacturers, especially small and mid-sized device manufacturers, notifying a regulator that there's been a security issue is scary. And notifying customers that there's been an issue is scary. But I think there are a number of medical device manufacturers who have demonstrated that proactive communication about security issues is actually received pretty well, both by regulators and by customers. Two that I will call out as having done a really good job historically, both Philips and Becton Dickinson have over the years, as early as 2018 when I started tracking these statistics, have been very proactive about putting out vulnerability disclosure notices and letting users know what happens. And maybe the first or second disclosure is a little scary, and people say, "Hey, what's up?" and somebody writes a news story about it. But if we're being honest about cybersecurity in medical devices, vulnerabilities are found all the time, right? The open source software that we're using to build these devices, new vulnerabilities come out every week. So it is not crazy to think that a device manufacturer would have a security vulnerability disclosure every 6 months, and if they're on average. And if the device manufacturer is putting out these vulnerability disclosures every 6 months, after a couple of them, the regulators and the hospitals say, oh, this is just the sign of a functioning post-market cybersecurity management process, right? Microsoft comes out with announcements about vulnerabilities all the time, and they patch their software regularly. That's what we should be aspiring to as medical device manufacturers. So back to my earlier comment about positioning these investments well for executives. I think that historically it was very difficult to show a return on investment for cybersecurity investments for device manufacturers, but it's gotten much, much easier, right? Because we can say definitively to our leadership, hey, on average, it takes us, X number of months to get it through a 510(k) approval process. We have seen other device manufacturers be delayed by 3 to 9 to 18 months. Such a delay would cost us X number of dollars in revenue, and we think the probability of it happening is Y. That's a very easy calculation to do, right? Another lever that we've seen be really, really effective is product security teams highlighting the sales impact of perceived cybersecurity issues. I've heard stories from product security leaders who have worked with their sales leadership to say, hey, tell me every time that we lose a sale or we are excluded from a procurement process due to the failure to meet our customer cybersecurity issues. Because if you go to your leadership and say, hey, I'm going to make up a number here, we lost $40 million in sales last year because we were unable to we were unable to show that we satisfied our customers' cybersecurity requirements, lost $40 million. How much is it going to cost to fix that? $4 million in a year, done. That's like the best ROI possible, right? So being able to understand what the economic impacts are for the entity is really useful for product security leaders who are advocating for increased investment. And then one other thing that is talked about much less frequently than I think it should be, M&A is fairly common in medtech, right? There are a handful, maybe more than a handful, maybe 50 medical device manufacturers who are pretty big, and they tend to do acquisitions regularly. And what that means is, the bottom half of medical device manufacturers are M&A targets for these large medical device manufacturers. If you are working for one of these smaller firms and an acquisition by a big medical device manufacturer is a plausible outcome for your company, you better believe that the cybersecurity of your product will become a topic of discussion during the diligence period of that acquisition. A company that is acquiring a smaller company is always looking for reasons to get a discount on the deal, right? It's like somebody buying a house and doing a home inspection and trying to get $10,000 back because they found, mold somewhere. Um, as a small device manufacturer, ensuring that you have all of your ducks in a row around product security is going to essentially make the acquisition price higher. And that's a great selling point for leadership. Conversely, if you are a large device manufacturer that is acquiring smaller ones, it is very important to do good product security diligence during the acquisition. There are a fair number of very high profile acquisitions that have happened in the last 5 or 6 years where the acquired company had product security issues that ended up costing the acquirer significant money after the acquisition closed. So we historically have heard large device manufacturers including security questions as part of the diligence process. We are seeing more and more of these companies really look into the security of these products before they acquire them, because it is one facet of the quality of the product. And don't be surprised if penetration testing happens during these diligence processes. So three things that you can do now, and again, I promise to try to make this as not salesy as possible. I'm going to try to stay true to that, but really run a scope assessment to figure out of your product portfolio and the ancillary products and services and systems that are around your medical device, which of them are in the purview of the European CRA regulations that are going into effect September 11th. Like much, much better to figure that out now than to figure it out when something goes wrong. Once you identify those systems that are subject to this regulation, put in place the processes to monitor for security signals in the process, and really write up a very detailed, coordinated vulnerability disclosure process that you will be able to use when and if something happens. Number two, audit your pre-market package, right? If you have a medical device that is going to FDA or going for approval in the EU within the next year, it would be a really good process to go through and look at that submission package and figure out what are the gaps between the security documentation we have today and what the FDA is requiring in the pre-market guidance. That's something that you can do, on your own to some degree. We help device manufacturers do that all the time. But really getting ahead of what the gaps will be early will be really, really helpful, and will help you avoid a situation where approval is delayed or a device is found to be not approvable. And then finally, take a look at your post-market vulnerability management processes, because number one, it is the law today that medical device manufacturers need to monitor the security of their devices that are already out in the field. But you better believe that for any device that is going for approval in the pre-market process, the FDA and the regulators in the EU are going to look at your post-market processes as well to make sure that once this device is approved and is out in the field, it's going to be secure for the expected life of the device. If any of this sounds relevant to you, these are all things that we help device manufacturers do. We would love to talk and see if we can be helpful. And if we can't, we're happy to make some recommendations as to what you can do on your own. And the only sort of plug I'll do for what we're doing at MedCrypt here directly, we have a tool set we've built called MedCrypt Security Intelligence, MSI, which is a toolbox for product security leaders and quality folks at device manufacturers to do many of the processes that we've discussed here, right? Assess the post-market vulnerability management process that is currently in place, to look at pre-market submissions to identify potential gaps between it and the FDA's regulations, to even help with responses to FDA warning letters or hold letters. We spent a lot of time building this tooling to make it very, very useful for device manufacturers to make sure that their device gets to market and stays on market. And so this is something that resonates with you. We would love to talk. Great. So hopefully that was helpful. Not too salesy here. I'd love to answer any questions that anybody has here. I'm driving the Q&A here. Let's see. From Brianna, I'm interested in hearing more about operating systems and programming languages. What are some criteria and examples of recommended operating systems and programming languages? Is memory safety really something FDA is cracking down on? And how does that impact use of things like C++? Awesome. Okay, some of this I'm very qualified to answer. Some of it I'm less qualified to answer, and I'll try to be transparent about that. So number one, operating systems and programming languages. I wouldn't say that there are recommended operating systems and programming languages. I think it's more that the FDA knows to look for specific operating systems that are no longer supported. We will still see medical devices that run Windows 7, and Windows 7, to the best of my knowledge, is no longer supported by Microsoft. So if a security vulnerability is found, Microsoft's not going to fix it. Plus, any version of Windows 7 you're currently using likely has many security vulnerabilities that are known and are actively being exploited, and that's a problem for FDA, right? So using a modern operating system that is currently supported either natively by the by Microsoft or through some extended service contract, or is being actively maintained in the open source community is really, really important. Um, there are a couple of high profile vulnerabilities affecting specific old versions of operating systems. And if you are running an affected operating system, it would be a very good idea to upgrade. One that I'm thinking of is, the QNX operating system is a great operating system that many people use. It's my understanding that there was a set of versions of it, of the 6.5 release, that had a fairly high profile vulnerability called Bad Alec, or a vulnerability that was related to Bad Alec. So if you're running a version of QNX 6.5 that is affected by this vulnerability, you should expect to get questions from the FDA about it. But aside from that, what are recommended operating systems? Lots of people are using Windows 11 and different versions of Linux and Ubuntu and QNX and all of these things, and those are all great. The priority is making sure that you're showing that it's maintained correctly. What versions of programming languages? Again, I haven't seen any preference from regulators around specific programming languages. Like I haven't seen a regulator say, hey, you should rewrite this in Rust. Um, Maybe some people think that would be a good idea, but that's not something that we have seen. What we have seen is device manufacturers making sure that you have processes in place to know what software you are using and to monitor that software for vulnerabilities. So just one example off the top of my head, there are lots of medical devices that have companion applications that are mobile apps, and those mobile apps can be designed to run on iOS and on Android. And sometimes we see device manufacturers say, yeah, we have a mobile app and it runs Android. And FDA will say, well, like, what version of Android? And then they'll come back and say, okay, we're running, version 4 dot whatever of Android. But then the FDA says, okay, but that's it. You're just running Android. You're not running any other packages or libraries or issues there. And what we have seen regulators get upset about is not the specific programming languages or even packages or libraries, but they seem to get upset if the device manufacturer is not transparent about what is being used and doesn't have a process in place to monitor the security of it. And then the last question about memory safety, I'm not an embedded engineer. You should never let me write code that goes on an embedded system. But I have never seen a hold letter from FDA that relates specifically to memory safety. But I have seen many, urgent cybersecurity vulnerability responses, either software updates or recalls, that are a consequence of memory issues. Right. So having, a buffer overflow or something like that is a very real security issue that happens regularly. So again, it's more about your ability to identify these issues and respond to them than it is about, specific operating systems or languages. Brianna, hopefully that was helpful. Another question: does MedCrypt analyze and make recommendations on supply chain security and internal information security? So supply chain security, absolutely, especially as it relates to software that is going into medical devices. So we have a lot of internal expertise on software bills of material, SBOMs, and we have a software tool called Helm, which does an analysis of SBOMs to look for vulnerabilities. But we don't look at we don't spend a lot of time on enterprise security supply chain issues. Like we're not going to audit your suppliers directly for their compliance with things or make recommendations for enterprise security type things. We're really focused on the device itself and what goes into the device. And primarily that is understanding what software is in there and what known vulnerabilities affect that software. Thanks for those questions. Really, really appreciate it. Excellent. Well, if anybody has any additional questions, I'm happy to take them here during the webinar. Also happy to answer any questions. My email is mike@medcrypt.com. I'm always happy to talk. I'm not a very good salesperson, which means if you send me an email and you have a problem, I'm happy to make a recommendation as to how to best solve that problem, even if it doesn't mean working with us. I'm very mission driven about this problem. I started MedCrypt in 2016 thinking, oh, there are cybersecurity problems in medtech and we're going to fix them in 2 years and then I'll move on and do something else. This has become a passion for me, and I've been working on this for the last 13 or 14 years and expect to work on it for another 13 or 14 more. Tons of work to do here. I want to see our industry improve its cybersecurity resiliency. I think it's going to become only more important in the future. And if there's anything I can do to help you or your organization improve or understand your risk, I'm absolutely happy to do it. So thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it, and hope to talk to you soon. Thanks.